I had the chance to stay with Austin Alomio on Friday night, and I was driving home from the hospital yesterday morning, from Children's Hospital, and I was behind this ginormous truck, and this truck essentially had two outrageously large bumper stickers on it, plastered basically across the entire back of the truck. And the first sticker was in English, and the second sticker was in Spanish. And the English one said, "Find Jesus, suffer no more." I'm pretty sure the Spanish sticker said the same thing, but there's no guarantees since my Spanish reading skills are nada. That was Spanish, right? Uh, and then along the side of the truck, there were stickers with single words, and these were all of the things that finding Jesus would immediately remove from your life. Find Jesus, suffer no more. I'd like to find this Jesus a lot. This is the Jesus that actually began to first capture my attention as a teenager. A Jesus who suffers for us. A Jesus who suffers in our place so that we don't have to. A Jesus who takes away the very worst parts of our life, who fixes, who gives us the desires of our hearts, who blesses us, and who gives us our best life now. I found this Jesus to be an appealing Jesus. And the first couple years of high school were somewhat rough for me, but things had started to turn themselves around mid-high school, right around the same time that I had begun to consider Jesus. Jesus was going to be, in my view of my life, a sort of shot of adrenaline to the positive changes I was already going through. I had begun to clean up my lifestyle. I was getting better grades. I was getting more involved in school. I had begun to make college plans and was sort of making friends in a way I hadn't in the last couple years. And in my conception of my life, Jesus was sort of the final piece of the puzzle, the final accessory to the life that I was busy creating for myself. Find Jesus, suffer no more would have been a great way to sum up my early interest in Jesus. 13 years later, I'm driving away from a hospital where a young man named Austin is wearing a metal halo that's been screwed into his skull. And for 23 hours a day, every day, for 5 weeks, Austin's halo is attached to a rope that holds 50 plus pounds of weight on it. And on Tuesday, he'll have his third major surgery in the last few years, where they'll extend the metal rods in his back up into his neck, and they'll repair the rods that have been broken in his lower back. And so after 8 hours of surgery, he'll stay another several weeks in the hospital recovering and rehabbing. And as I drive and I see this guy's sticker, "Find Jesus, suffer no more," I have to ask the question, does this mean Austin has not found Jesus because he still suffers? Does this mean Anthony and Denise have no idea who Jesus is because they suffer with Austin? Does this mean that their prayers mean nothing? Is their faith too weak? Certainly not. But what are we to do with this man and his bumper sticker? This man with his efficient, measurable, predictable, controllable Jesus. I wonder how this man would respond to the God we've been encountering in Genesis over the last 8 weeks. In fact, I wonder which is closer to the Jesus that has been revealed to us in the New Testament. This man's bumper sticker, Jesus, or the God that we get in Genesis. I think it's the God we get in Genesis. But as we finish up this morning in the book of Genesis, preparing to move on into Exodus, and just to remind you, our end goal is Joshua this year. So 10 weeks in Genesis, we'll go Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. First 6 books of the Bible. It's ambitious. We'll make it, hopefully. There are 3 things I want to do together this morning. The first thing I want to do is just summarize where we've been in Genesis so far, retracing our steps through this book, and hopefully in a small way, re-encountering the God that we've been encountering the last 2 months in these passages. Second, I want to make some sort of closing observations on Genesis based in these last couple chapters of the book. And then lastly, what I'd like to do is I'd like to consider some of the bumper sticker versions of God that are around us, and to consider them in light of the God that is revealed to us in the book of Genesis. And my goal through all of this is to make the case that the God of Genesis, the Lord, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, is the God who makes sense of our world, who makes sense of our suffering in a way that Find Jesus, Suffer No More never can. Israel's God, revealed to us in Genesis, is the God who invites us into relationship with him through his Son by means of his Spirit. But if we accept these ancient texts on their own terms, we quickly learn as we read these stories that relationship with this God is kind of a bumpy road. It is an uncertain journey with unpredictable detours, and worst, or best of all, depending on how you look at it, we walk with a God who refuses to be controlled by us. And so let's take a few moments to consider this God that we've encountered in these texts over the last 10 weeks. It began in the beginning, when God created. Genesis isn't very interested in detached hypothetical questions about the nature of God. Who God is can be seen through what God does. And so, what does God do? Well, he creates. But he creates an earth that is incomplete. Good, but incomplete. And then he creates creatures called humans to carry out and to finish his creative work with him. If you know anything about delegation, you know delegation, not delegating, is always easier, and it is always faster to do any project by yourself, right? And yet here at the opening of the story, God is delegating his creative work to his creatures called humans. God immediately reveals himself then to be someone who is less interested in efficiency than he is in intimacy. God creates creatures to bear his image, that are like him in some profound way. They are his priests, and creation is his temple. He blesses them and he commands them to fill the earth with his image, with his likeness. God makes a garden, and he puts 2 humans in it, and he walks with them in the garden, and he gives these humans everything. He withholds nothing from them except the fruit of a single tree. But this God has decided to give these humans a choice. He lets them choose poorly. He lets them rebel. And he also exiles them from their garden paradise. And God doesn't at this point choose to put an end to human rebellion, but he allows it to spread like cancer over the entire earth until humans have brought to ruin all that God made and called good. And he grieves deeply, he regrets, and he releases the floodwaters over the earth. And he starts over, yet he remains committed to this project. Finding favor with a human, Noah is said to be blameless in his generation, and he walks with God, and God commands Noah, and Noah obeys God, and God makes a covenant with a human. And then God makes a covenant with creation. Genesis tells this incredible story of a God who seems to enjoy promising the impossible. But the God that Genesis describes also seems to get equal pleasure out of fulfilling these promises in unlikely and improbable ways. God also seems, as the story unfolds, legitimately concerned about humans and their capabilities. At the Tower of Babel, it would seem that God has made these humans to be pretty powerful. Their potential, their strength, these seem to be dangerous to the purposes of God, but at the same time, they seem to be essential to his purposes. God takes these humans who together have such potential and strength and power, and he disperses them, he spreads them, he scatters them. And in the midst of families and tribes and people that have been scattered across the earth, God calls out to one people, one tribe, one family. God throws all of his eggs in the one family's basket. He hitches his wagon to this one tribe. God makes irrevocable promises to this one people. God invites this family, first Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, to walk with him. And he invites them to be a blessing to all of the peoples of the earth. He chooses them in order that they might do righteousness and justice on the earth. And he asks them to trust him with his promises, to trust him with their lives, to trust God with their families and with their futures. And as God is with them, is with this family is trying to figure out what it means to then be with God. When God promises the impossible, they keep coming up with these really creative solutions that seem more probable. As the future appears threatened to them, they retreat time and time again into their familiar and their safe modes of self-sufficiency. But with each generation, we get the sense that God's choice has not been in vain. That God will work out his purposes in this family, both with their help and in spite of their help. We see this most recently in Joseph as we think back to previous weeks. What Joseph's brothers meant for evil, God was able to use for good. But then we also heard in the story of Judah, the disaster that Judah created around himself would result not only in Judah's own transformed character, but a preserved line through whom the kings of Israel would come, and eventually the Messiah. Genesis gives us a strange picture of God. We find a God who provides for his people through strange means. He gives to Jacob an expanding flock of sheep. And for some reason, he lets Jacob go on thinking that it's his own superstitious practice that was the cause of it. When famines strike, the God who holds back the waters sends his people to faraway lands to dwell for extended periods of time. We find a God in Genesis who judges wickedness with death. Sometimes. The earth is flooded. Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed with fire. Ur and Onan are struck down. But Noah's sons are spared, and Lot is spared, and Judah is spared. We find a God in Genesis who has global purposes. His intentions are that the whole earth would be blessed. And yet, God sets in motion a plan that, according to our frame of reference, has taken thousands upon thousands of years to unfold and yet has not even been finished yet. God has a bottom line. All of the families of the earth are to be blessed. But rather than develop a ministry plan that multiplies his blessing impact, he picks a family of two, Abraham and Sarah, and after decades, he turns them into a whopping family of three. This is not multiplication. Granted, things start to pick up a little bit after a couple generations, but we can't help to notice, but God doesn't really seem to be in a hurry to make these barren couples more fruitful. Again, as much as God has this vision of multitudes, sand and stars, it's not the numbers of people that drive him, but the kind of people he seems to be interested in. See, large schools of fish can be caught at once with a net, but people learn to trust one at a time, in relationship, over time. And so God has in mind an earth full of people who know him, who trust him, who are blessed by him. But even the blessing isn't very predictable or totally clear in Genesis. God is blessing Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their families, and yet they still suffer loss. Their loved ones die. They die. They experience the pain of family strife and sibling rivalry. Brothers try to kill brothers. Family members lie to each other. They hurt each other. They manipulate each other. What does it mean to be blessed by God? In the midst of pain and suffering, loss and rejection, humiliation, jealousy and failure. This is one of the questions that Genesis draws us into. And it's one of the questions that reminds us that Genesis is as relevant today as it ever was for God's people. That's my quick summary of Genesis. It's probably been an insufficient summary, right? There's probably a million other things I could have said, could have focused on, but there it is, after 10 weeks. But I want to look for a few moments at where the story has come to. In chapter 48, we find the last section of the book. Genesis transitions to its conclusion. And it does so with the phrase, after this, setting us apart from Joseph's story. We're now in the end. And here we have the deaths of two different figures. First there's Jacob, and then there's Joseph. Both before dying, both Jacob and Joseph have closing words that they offer. Both often offer a reminder of what God has in store for the future. And both have words for the sons of Jacob. Jacob for his sons and Joseph for his brothers. And Jacob blesses his sons, or as you heard Derek ambiguously referred to earlier, he prophesizes or blesses or somethings them, right? He speaks words to them that Genesis calls a blessing, and yeah, it's hard to understand these words as a blessing, because this is what he says of his son Gad. Gad shall be raided by raiders. Don't bless me like that. But he shall raid at their heels. I don't even know what that means. What do we make of these blessings? They don't sound like blessings. Sound kind of like curses almost. And we're left sort of pondering these people, thinking, man, These 12 tribes, these 12 sons of Israel are just as ambiguous as any of the other characters that we've met all along the way. And yet, they aren't ambiguous to God. Jacob's last words to Joseph in chapter 48 are, "I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your ancestors." God is faithful. God is faithful isn't an abstract idea. God is faithful is a concrete reality. It is a story. God has promised to be with Abraham's descendants. He has promised to bring them back to the land. And here, those promises are affirmed and confirmed. As ambiguous as we might find these characters, these sons of Israel, God's commitment to them is unwavering. And yet, we can't help but be confused or frustrated with how God intends to fulfill these promises, right? Great, God is faithful. God will be with us. That ought to mean something good ought to come our way in our lifetime. Except with the death of Joseph, 300 more years will pass before anyone gets a whiff that God is on the move. Who among us is okay with the idea that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, and that the plan for your life may involve you being born into slavery and dying in slavery? But don't worry, through your faithfulness, another generation, several from you, will be set free and will see the promised blessings. Put that on a bumper sticker. While Jacob gave his sons a traditional parental blessing, prophecy, thing, set of words, Joseph gives the sons of Jacob different words at the end of Genesis. To a group of brothers that were scared, Joseph offers them words of peace. To his brothers who were scrambling to protect themselves from the potential of Joseph's wrath, Joseph tells them why they can trust God and trust God's purposes, and by default then trust him. And to his brothers who were uncertain about the future, he promises to continue living as a blessing for their sake. As Joseph prepares to die, then he repeats Jacob's promise, almost word for word. Joseph sets his eyes on God's future promises, and he reminds his brothers that God is trustworthy, even if his timeline and his process and some of his methods might seem a little, can I say insane? Is that all right? Maybe not insane, just weird. I'm going to go there. Cool. As we finish Genesis, I want to suggest one of the reasons why we have such a hard time with the God that we find in Genesis. And I think it primarily has to do with the gods of our own making. The gods that we put on our bumper stickers. In the early 1990s, which seems forever ago, right? But it was only 2 decades ago, there was a professor named George Ritzer. And he looked around our culture and he described it as the McDonaldization of society. And what he meant was the values that have given shape and form to our booming fast food industry are actually shaping and forming us as a fast food culture. These values at the heart of our culture include efficiency, measurability, predictability, and control. McDonald's is driven by efficient processes at every level of the company. McDonald's is driven by a bottom line commitment to profit. McDonald's is driven by confidence that every cheeseburger in every store will be predictably the same. And McDonald's is driven by the idea that through control over people and process and brand, that the McDonald's brand will provide an identical experience to people everywhere. This is the heart of McDonaldization. Ritzer then details in his book how these values then are also at work in our culture in all kinds of unexpected places. And about 10 years after this book was written, a guy named John Drain wrote a book called The McDonaldization of the Church, in which he uses Ritzer's scholarship to describe to use the categories to describe what has happened in the church. That the church has willingly adopted our culture's values of efficiency, measurability, predictability, and control. And these govern our lives together, our sense of mission, our sense of calling, and our sense of who God is. Remember, though, what I said at the very beginning. Genesis tells us who God is by what God does. And so something happens to the church as we begin to adopt these values that drive our culture, and they begin to shape and form what the church does. What happens is we begin to ascribe those values of the things that we do to our God. And so churches can quickly and easily begin to create a God or gods in the image of our own cultural values. And so, wherever you see a church that looks like a fast food restaurant, we ought to be wary. Because a fast food restaurant cannot serve anything other than fast food, and a fast food church cannot offer anything other than a fast food God. And a fast food God is a God who comes in catchy and repeatable slogans, who fits nicely on a bumper sticker, and who is neatly packaged in finely tuned and repeatable emotional experiences. A fast food God is a God who is simple, without any kind of complexity that would really require too much thinking, and who immediately appeals to our senses and our impulses. A fast food God is a God who is remarkably efficient. Come down to the altar and you will be fixed. Pray a prayer and you will be saved. Find Jesus and suffer no more. A fast food God is a God who is measurable. If I have stuff, I've been blessed. If I have more stuff, I've been more blessed. If I have no stuff, I have not been blessed. You see, figuring this God out requires nothing more than a first grade math level. A fast food God is also a God who is predictable. A God who can always be counted on to do exactly what we think he should do. Listen for God always in our language. We desperately cling to stability in the midst of chaotic and unpredictable times. And finally, a fast food God is a God that I can control. God is a formula. If I spend X amount of time reading and praying and doing the things I'm supposed to do, God will do X for me. It's really easy. If I adjust the numbers, the variables, I can predict the outcome. I can control what God will do for me. All I need is the right combination of words, the right heart, the right attitude, or whatever, and God will give me the desires of my heart. The truth is, we find ourselves and our faith practice and our worship of God falling into and being controlled by these values probably far more often than we realize, because they are our cultural values. They have a place in our heart, and we have to actively work against them. And we have to actively work against them because this fast food God really, if we're honest, looks a lot more like the genie from Aladdin than he does anything we find in the Bible, especially Genesis. Right? A genie, snaps his fingers and efficiently produces our wishes. A genie even tells you exactly how many wishes you get. A genie will do whatever you wish. And this is the best part about genies. They come in a neat little jar so that the genie can go back in when you're bored with them or you don't need them in the moment. God, on the other hand, the God who has revealed himself to us in these scriptures, who has revealed himself to us in the book of Genesis, is capable of speaking universes into existence, and yet chooses to lead his people into Egypt, away from the promised land, where they will become slaves and will suffer at the hand of the Egyptians for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. And he will respond, but when he is ready. This doesn't have the marks of efficiency, according to my categories of efficiency. God who numbers the hairs on our heads and who's not willing that any should perish but all come to eternal life, doesn't tell us how many, doesn't tell us how long, doesn't tell us how many resources he's going to provide us with. He seems to give us what he gives us and says, reach as many as you can for as long as you still have breath. Okay, here we go. And God continues to surprise us, doesn't he? God continues to remain mysterious. Even those who understand their hope and are working for the kingdom are often taken back in unexpected ways when God breaks into their lives and redirects us in these unpredictable kinds of ways that only God can do. And God, who is creator of heaven and earth, who through Jesus continues to hold all things together, this God refuses to be co-opted for our purposes, made to do our bidding, controlled by us. All around us, there are people who hear the Bible describe God, and with a wave of the hand and a little Jedi mind trick, try to convince us this is not the God you're looking for. And just like that, we are ready to move along in search of gods of our own making. Because the God who reveals himself to us in Scripture says that following him will cost us our very lives.